Gunachishtakatyahan, Yik Hachi Adi. It's good that you've all come here today. Today's session for the Sharing Our Knowledge Conference 2024 is with Eric Hollinger, Dukwu. He is Teikweidi. I met Eric in 2017 when I went to the Smithsonian, and he today is going to be doing recent 3D projects with Teikweidi clan leader Dan Brown, and also working with the Wrangell Cooperative Association. And today he's going to be doing a 3D that specializes from the Smithsonian and the University of Southern Florida, who helped the Teikweidi clan leader Dan Brown make a replica of the clan hat. It's the clan Mother Bear hat, and they worked with also, where I'm from, Wrangell Cooperative Association, to begin a 3D digitized Chief Shake's 45-foot-long Brown Bear Canoe for educational and cultural perpetual purposes. Please welcome Mr. Eric Hollinger, Dukwu.
Thank you, Virginia. Gunachis the Teikweidi for allowing me to be here and hosting this conference here today. Shekakwan, Gunachis Kagwantan, Gunachis, all the Raven and Eagle clans of the area and the region. I'm really proud to be here. I think I've been coming to the conferences since 2007. So some of you already know me, and maybe that's the only reason why you're here, to share some support and express. We do that for each other's presentations, right, as much as possible. But for those that don't, maybe this is the first time you're seeing some of what we've been doing, I work for the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. We are the world's largest museum complex with over, I think, 19 museums and 2 more just created on paper, 151 million cataloged items in the collections. Everything from the space shuttle may be one, a flea may be one, so hard to count things like that in such a big range. But the Natural History Museum has 148 million of those items, and ranging full range of natural history collections and many Native American, Native Alaska artifacts. Over the years, you've heard me present on them, and you've seen some of our 3D digitization and replication collaborations. I'm a tribal liaison in the repatriation office. Our primary focus is repatriation of human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony. But in our work, we have been finding that many tribes are also interested in going beyond repatriation or working in conjunction with repatriation to utilize 3D technologies for additional education and cultural perpetuation purposes that go beyond the traditional perspectives on repatriation. And some of those projects you may have seen or heard about in the past, like the replication of the Sitka Teikweidi sculpin hat, which is in the National Park Service facility here, but is atu. It is a crust object of the Teikweidi. And we brought that to the community, helped remake it, and brought it in 2019. And you can see more online. If you just Google Smithsonian 3D sculpin hat, you will see an 11-minute video that tells the whole story of that collaboration. So what I'm doing here today, though, is providing you some updates on some additional collaborations that we've been doing since that time. And today I will focus, as Virginia mentioned, on 2 projects, working with the Teikweidi and Wrangell Cooperative Association. With the Teikweidi, Daniel Brown, the leader of the Teikweidi, who many of you know, passed recently, and I should preference, there will be some difficult slides. So I want to prepare yourself for. There may be some things that are emotionally challenging to see, but the families felt it important to share the story of this collaboration with our museum, because this was his last act as clan leader. So at the 2019 Sculpin Hat Kuweek, Dan brought forward bear hats, Teikweidi hats you see on these tables here. And from that conference and previous conference that we've done, this is the first year that I haven't brought with me digitization equipment or digitization specialists to help scan objects for clan leaders, to at least archive the files in case something happens to their atu in the future, house burns down or something. We have ways that the technology could then be at least tapped for traditional artists or machines to help replace. And Dan recognized the potential for that as he saw the power of that with the sculpin hat replication. And Dan and other clan leaders at that conference brought forward their hats to have them digitized. And Dan participated in the digitization of the mother bear hat, one of the few hats to survive the bombardment of Rangoon, is what I understand. So University of South Florida libraries helped us. We had a combined Smithsonian University of South Florida team there to digitize hats, and clan leaders participated in the scanning of their own atu. With Dan's hat, the black was very shiny and black, and the scanners, these are structured light scanners, they have a little difficulty because that black can absorb the light, and it can be a little reflective there because it's kind of shiny. So the scanning guys said that, well, one technique they use sometimes is to put like a talcum powder or flour on there or things like that. And Dan said, well, let's do that. And we said, well, we're not going to do that. We're trained by conservators. Don't put anything on an important object. He's like, well, go to the store and buy some talcum powder and I'll put it on myself. And so he put it on. It's fine if the clan leader does it, but we're not going to presume to do that. So he applied the powder on that, so it kind of lightened up the surface a little bit so the scanner could actually capture that geometry. And then looking at the hat, we recognize if it were needed to be replaced for some reason in the future, if it were dropped, one of the weakest parts of it were those bear paws that stick out over the rim. That would be the thing that might most likely get broken off. There's separate pieces that have been bolted to the hat. And so when we talked with Dan about that, we said it might be most efficient to scan those separately because if something happened, one of those broke, you could then just replace the paw. So Dan said, I've wanted for a long time to unbolt those. They haven't been unbolted in maybe 100 years, so I'm going to unbolt that. So he got a screwdriver, and again, we would not do it ourselves, but Dan unbolted the paws, and they were able to be scanned separately. So Dan had a great time. We had a great time working with him on exploring and learning more about this hat together. And once it was digitized, once it was in the computer, University of South Florida, they are digital magicians, especially Jorge Gonzalez, who you'll see in a minute. And digitally, he was able to go in and isolate the individual parts and attachment just in the computer. These were on there. Of course, he scanned the paws separately, but you could see he did this with the copper eyebrows, the ears, the inlaid shell. And the reason to do this is because Dan wanted to do more than just digitize it and set the files aside to archive them. He asked us, could we make a 3D replica of the hat for educational purposes, not to replace as atu, not to have in a museum, but to have something that he could take into classrooms more easily. And I think some of you may have seen the video a couple days ago of the teachings of Dan Brown that Angie and Scott made that tell that story of his efforts, even in his last days, to teach kids. And that was what he had in mind. He had in mind how could he further use 3D replicas to teach kids, because it may not be appropriate to bring real atu in the classroom sometimes. You might not always have other atu to balance it, or certain risks, of course, that there are to bring in the real crust objects in that context. So he wanted to demonstrate to other clans and museums that this could be used this way, and so he asked us to work with him to make a 3D replica. And Jorge, with his digital magic, was able to essentially take apart the hat, just in a computer. These are not separate pieces. This was all a computer separated these with color and isolated even the nuts and bolts and pins that held the copper eyebrows in there. He was able to digitally recreate as separate pieces. With the digital files, he could also x-ray the hat, because he has the shape of the inside of the hat, the shape of the outside of the hat, and he can just make it transparent so you can see through it. University of South Florida actually printed this onto a metal picture that to give to Dan to put on his wall because it's very beautiful. You can also see where the carver on the left side of the hat went so deep and in there to try to hollow that out to make it lighter that they actually came in contact with the eye. Digitally, if you were to take off the shell inlay on that, you could actually see the hole where the carver pierced through the eye. So they were hiding that pierce with the shell inlay. And that's something that you can see. You didn't actually x-ray it, but overlaying the files on this, you can actually see its geometry inside and out. So with the 3D digitally exploded parts of this, including the potlatch rings, then it's possible to 3D print it. Now, the University of South Florida, unlike the Smithsonian, had never printed anything this complex or this large, so they weren't quite sure if they could do it. So they first 3D printed a small scale model. I think this is about half scale, maybe 1/3 scale. You can see by the size of my fingers in there. And then they sent it to us at the Smithsonian, since our model makers had experience with this, and I took it into SI Exhibits, who does this regularly, and showed it to them and asked what did they think, what advice do they have for University of South Florida if they were to make a bigger one. Because their printer can't actually print something that big. It would have to be printed in parts. And this small scale version, then we were able to mail to Dan and get his feedback on. And he picked up some flaws on it, and he recognized some issues where it should have been finer detail. And so with that feedback, they were able to then work with a larger model. And I was able to consult with Dan after he got sick and was seeking treatment in Anchorage. We had trips that overlapped there, so we spent some time together and were able to go through the digital files and look at it to again, get some final details. And I think he pointed out that there were actually some inlays on the back of the Mother Bear hat that weren't recognized, and so that we had to have Jorge go back, find those, and remember, yes, those were shell, you need to pull those off too. And so he was able to do that. So it's good to have that feedback, even at distances of so many thousands of miles between even us in the DC and University of Florida and Dan in Alaska. So when it came time to printing, they had to print this in separate parts. And you can see these different colorized sections just to illustrate how the different pieces had to be printed and then milled together. And you can see this lattice-like structure that's beneath them. That's like a build structure. When the 3D printer builds it up, it builds those frame that then the solid pieces are mounted on, because it has to have some structural support. Once those are printed in the printer, then the technician goes in and they physically cut off those ladders, that little structure part there to make individual pieces. But then he had to fuse those pieces together. And that was something they'd never done before, and the Smithsonian even does rarely. So you can print things separately and fuse them, and he did an incredible job to where you can't tell the difference. Now the rest of the pieces, since there was real shell, real copper on them, Dan wanted them done with real materials. So with the 3D files as a guide, we actually cut real shell inlays out of abalone, and that was at the Smithsonian Institution exhibits. They were generous enough to allow their equipment to be used. So we got real shell and cut it into the shapes using the 3D pieces that Jorge had printed as a guide. So I had those 3D pieces, life-size 3D pieces, and I could pick out parts of the shell that had the right contours and geometry on it and then cut it to shape to fit that. But then how could I be sure that it would actually fit the hat? Well, I had to get together with Jorge, and we have the shell pieces here and his 3D printed pieces there, and we actually placed each one in the mouth of the bear, where he had digitally removed it. When he printed the whole hat, he digitally excised all the shell and erased them in the files to create those spaces for them to fit. And then we fit them in, and they had to go in exactly the right order in the sequence. So each of these pieces of tape on there mark the orientation and the number of each individual piece. Travis Doring and Jorge with the whole printed hat here. You can see it came together really well. It is separate pieces, so there's a worry you drop that and it could bust into those different parts. And their team leader, Lori Collins, with the University of South Florida, she runs this whole team that does this work. She was not able to join us for that, but I really can't thank her and her whole team for what they did. They've never done something like this before, but part of Dan's request was to challenge us, challenge the university, challenge the Smithsonian. Can we do more? Can we demonstrate the potential of this technology for educational purposes? Once the hat was 3D printed like that, then we took it to Alaska. We had hopes of bringing Dan to the Smithsonian and assemble the hat with him there, with the original hat. He felt too ill to do that. We were going to get film crews into his house to interview him with the hat. He felt too ill to do that. And when we heard reports of just how sick he had become, we knew we had to move fast to We got the hat to Dan, rushed it to the hospital to show him how far we'd gotten, and then we quickly went to his house and began 3 days. We took over their kitchen and used the original hat as the guide for painting it. This is retired model maker Carolyn Tome. She's adopted Teikweidi. Dan was pleased that Teikweidi were going to work on the hat. And he wanted, you can see the mother bear hat, the original is a little tan or brown. And you can see parts of red peeking out from under that. So from the start when we were scanning it, Dan said it used to be painted red. Somebody painted over that. If we remake it, I want it red like the original was. And so he felt the man who married the bear hat on the right that was repatriated from the Museum of the American Indian, it should be that red. So that's why we have both hats out on the table. Both were guides to what Dan wanted this hat restored to. So Carolyn painted away for 3 days. And we attached real copper, trying to match the original as much as possible. So that too was made by Smithsonian model maker Chris Hulschwander, who carved the sculpin hat. So he contributed as well with making these pieces to try to match. And there were some nail-biting moments here and there because to attach the ears, we had to actually drill into the plastic with a drill there. And Carolyn, thank goodness it was her, not me, had to drill into that, and we weren't sure would that plastic just explode because this plastic is, I mean, it's plastic, and it's hollow. The pieces, including the ears, are hollow inside to make it light enough. So it has that structure, that lattice work throughout it. It still, in total, feels heavy. And actually, when we presented it to Dan in his bed, one of the things he was able to say was heavy. And but it's not much heavier than the wood, but it is plastic. And so drilling into it, everything worked out fine. She was able to attach the ears. Even the underside was painted to look like wood, threaded with real leather for the chin straps. The bear paws, when Dan popped off the bear paws on the original, we noticed there was a residue there, almost like a glue. And we speculated about what that was. And we thought, well, maybe it could be some kind of resin, some kind of tree sap or something. And I told him, hey, there's Smithsonian scientists that could probably analyze that for you and tell you what it is. So he just scraped a bit off and put it in a little bag and said, here, take it to those guys and have them see what it is. So we did that, and they determined that, yeah, it was probably a spruce resin. So we used, even though this was plastic and we were bolting the paws back on, we actually used real spruce resin and put under that to bolt it on, so it replaced as much as possible and replicated as much as possible in the way the original was made. And then we did bolt it down, and even the screws that were in the original, Jorge was able to print those screws to where they could actually screw in. So we used a combination of real metal and real plastic screws that were 3D printed to bolt down those paws. Real human hair, donated by Thea Brown's son, Charles. Again, we had to drill into the hat again, this time at an angle, and then insert the tufts of hair. 3D printed the spruce potlatch rings, so those are then rigid. They're not going to be as flexible as the originals in real ermine skin. And that's the finished hat. So you can see it's really almost identical. Even knife marks are replicated by the 3D printing, and it's really just some variations in the color that once they're side by side. So once the hat was finished, I think it was around 7:30 at night, we rushed it over to the hospital to present it to Dan. His wife Thea, his nephew John, presented to him. So this completed his task, his request for us to make this hat for the Teikweidi for educational purposes, and this completed his last act as clan leader. He died 3 days later. Thea texted us to let us know and said that now he can go because he'd finished that. So this hat, we left it there. It was with him. And it is a Teikweidi as far as anybody is concerned. It is theirs for educational purposes. It is not Atu. It is, as some Tlingit have told us about some of these replicas, unless it goes through Kuwait, spirit put in it, it's a shadow. They've said about the wooden ones, they're just a piece of wood. In this case, it's just a piece of plastic, right? But it's a good representation of the original, and it has a lot of the elements of the original it brought forward. We learned more about the original hat by this effort, by this collaboration, perhaps than was known about the original hat before. So I think we hope we've helped bolster the clan's knowledge of the hat and use of the hat and their ability to be more flexible with when they talk about their history and the history of these hats. maybe without putting the originals at such risk in the future. So I think that's what Dan had in mind, and I think I think he has hopes that Teikweidi will use this technology, and other clans, other tribes, other museums will use it in ways that might be similarly responsible and thoughtful in how to blend these 3D technologies with cultural perpetuation. This is not repatriation. This is cultural perpetuation uses. How do the clans want to use them? So Gunakchish for bearing with me for that part of the story for that. And it was important for the family to see Dan completing his last acts. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit to the Wrangell Shakes Island 3D project with the Wrangell Cooperative Association. Most of you are familiar with Chief Shakes' canoe, which there were several canoes. He had several. This may be the only one still in existence. This picture shows that I think this is around probably 1887 in front of Shakes' house on the water. And notice the bears at the prow. There's a bear at the stern you can barely see. So this was collected, was purchased, and sent to the Smithsonian. I think it was accessioned around 1894 into our collections. And for over 50 years, it hung from the Arts and Industries building in what they call the Hall of Boats. And you can see all these boats hanging from the ceiling there. And one thing I want to point out, see here, the hull is not painted in this shot. But in this shot, it is painted. So it's kind of a mystery as to who painted it and when and how. And I kind of think maybe the museum painted this or had this painted. And it was to enhance its value and prestige from looking at it from down below. But that'll factor into what you would do with it in the future. Either way, it got painted, and it hung from the Hall of Boats until 1940s when World War II broke out, and they were worried about German bombers hitting D.C., and so they took all these boats down and they hid some away in caves. And then they, once it became clear the Germans were not going to make it to Washington, D.C., they took them back out and they moved them around. There's a lot of trouble to hang them back up. So some of them ended up outside the Natural History Museum in a courtyard. So then they were exposed to weather, and you can see people could come up and touch them. And they were like this, even in the 1970s as a kid when I first went there. I recall these being out there, and I recall being able to go up to them and touch the edges on them and in a sense, come in contact with them and just being exposed to the weather. But you can see they look pretty good in these photos. These photos might be from the 50s or 60s. The museum may have repainted it a couple times while they were out there, but ultimately the exposure took its toll, and it really weathered it and put it into bad shape. So you see the paint has really worn off. This is what it looks like when it moved into its new facility in 2003. It was put in a building, I think, in the 1980s, but then snow collapsed the roof on that building, and it remained that way until around, I think, the late 1990s, and then moved into its new facility, the Museum Support Center in Suitland, Maryland, in 2003, where it's in much better climate control, but the damage was already done. And the bears have been taken off, and their pedestals are separate, but you see paws are missing, ears are missing. There's been a lot of wear and tear and damage to it over time. These are drawings that the museum made of that paint pattern and the bears in place. And this, again, we aren't sure, is this something that museum shops people did as a guide for them to paint it or repaint it? Or was it something they were recording on what was actually on it originally? I think that it may have been a guide for the museum and may not have been original. But we have these preserved in the National Anthropological Archives, so if people want to restore these patterns, even for historical museum purposes, it may be possible. But in consultation with the Wrangell Cooperative Association and the Nanyaayi, the idea of 3D technology applied to this canoe and other objects from Wrangell became a real possibility, exploring what could be done with this. And 3D digitizing the canoe was a great interest. It's a Haida-made canoe, so the Haida also are interested in seeing 3D files of it because they could use that to teach their carvers how the canoe was made. But this led to a team from the Wrangell Cooperative Association, including Virginia here, who I'll ask to speak about their perspective here in a little bit. this team came to the Smithsonian to consult on repatriation matters, look at all the collections, and to launch 3D digitization of the canoe and other objects, and together with our repatriation team and our digitization team people there. And you can probably see the bears on pedestals there next to the canoe. It's a 45-foot long canoe, and starting with Llewellyn Knapp, with the Nanyai, she began scanning the bear, and different members of the team took turns scanning different objects. This is the female bear on the back. What Lou was scanning was the front of the canoe. Once the 3D files are scanned with that structured light scanner, then you can have the geometry of the bear. You can use that to mill or 3D print parts. You can put color on it and put it up on the web to tell the story of it in color without even 3D printing or replicating it. You can still share a lot of color and texture elements of it. And in theory, like we did with the sculpin hat, you could digitally repair this. You could replace the paws, you could fill the cracks, you could do shell inlays or add teeth back into it digitally or on a physical replica. So I think there's interest in at least digitally restoring it to the way it looked back in the 1880s when it was on the water. But it's a big task. Digitizing the whole canoe, I think we spent a couple days looking at other objects and taking turns digitizing the hull. And at this time, we could only digitize the outside of it because our conservators and the digitization team had not figured out a way to climb in. They didn't want us climbing inside it. And they realized they're going to have to create a boom arm like they do for the movies to have a scanner on the end of the boom arm and reach it down in there and scan it from a distance. So our team is actually going to come back in late January and February to finish scanning it, but they got a good start with the Wrangell team there. Here you see a good shot of the inside. And there were a couple long oars and a mast, or flagpole at least. And there were 5 paddles also, that mud shark paddles that are in the collections that came in with this canoe that can be scanned as well, or 3D digitized as well. Other objects also that were associated with Chief Shakes in our collections is this mud shark hat. That was a photo, I think, from 1906, 1908, and here's how it looks today. So it's the fins have been taken off of it, and some of those still exist in separate pieces. It's highly contaminated with mercury. We found while we were there, we did XRF testing with the tribe and showed that not only is the red paint mercury, which is often the case with these bright red paints from this time, but mercury was applied to the rest of the hat, probably as a pesticide. And that cape, that trailer, that waterfall is a kind of a, what do you call it? It's a rubberized canvas, so it's falling apart, it's disintegrating. In addition to this, there is a killer whale hat that we began digitizing. And so once these digital models are created in the computer, then what's next? What could be done with this? How can this be an aid? One of the elements of the conversation with the community is what is the potential for augmented reality or virtual reality to be used with these 3D files? They have Chief Shake's house now that was recreated in 2012, reconstructed. And one idea could be you could digitize these objects, and I don't know if I have is this a laser pointer somewhere? But just to the right of the stovepipe, you can actually see the shark hat there. And you can see the killer whale hats. There's several of them that look like the one that we have. I think some others were repatriated from another museum not long ago. But some of the other objects exist in other museums or have been repatriated, and you could digitize those in 3D, and you could put these inside the clan house, and you could give tourists an Oculus viewer to where they can go in the house and they can look around and they can see that hat right there. With augmented reality, they could actually pick up the hat and turn it if that's appropriate and look at it, or other objects, rattles or smaller things. But they could walk around the object with the Oculus viewer and look at it as if it's right there in front of them. In a sense, populate the house, maybe not quite as richly as this photo shows, but something closer to that. This is what the inside of the house looks like today. It does have a 20-foot or so canoe inside it that I think was intended to replicate a Chief Shake's canoe. And one of the first questions that we received was, given what you could do with the other hats, the other things that you've replicated, could you size down the bears in the computer to fit this 20-foot canoe and then mill new bears at that size to put on this? And I think we can do that. So that's something I think there's strong support from everybody that we worked with so far, that's a goal of the community, is they want us to try to, once those 3D files exist, to try to see what would it take to size them down and mill them out of wood, replace the shell, replace the teeth on them, and put them on this canoe inside the house. But I forgot to mention, with the Oculus Viewer, if we digitize the whole canoe, put the bears back on it, maybe even add the paint or not, depends on what the community wants. With the Oculus Viewer, when people come across that boardwalk walking towards the house today, they could have that Oculus Viewer on and they can look aside the boardwalk and they can see the canoe on the water, just like in that photograph from the 1880s. They could experience it that way. And with the poles, many of the poles are down from the renovation. The community's working on carving poles today, replacing those, putting those up. They may not be able to put as many up as once stood, but if 3D scanning can be done of those poles as well, an Oculus Viewer, they could experience the virtual reality, the canoe, the poles in places they once were, the objects in places they once were in the house, without posing risks or threats to the real or original objects. So again, who knows where this will go, but these are some of the possibilities that we're talking with right now with Wrangell Cooperative Association about what could be done and what might be appropriate to do. And who knows where we can go, but I'm learning with all of these 3D collaborations, every one we do, the tribes take us further and further in new areas that have never been done before between museums and tribes, but should be and could be. And I think the future will explode in different approaches. And all of these are pilots. All of these are models for others to learn from. And we all hope that we are doing them in good ways and will serve as good models. So I want to invite Virginia up to speak from the Wrangell Cooperative Association's perspective and experience with this. I don't want to be the only one speaking. You shouldn't hear just from the museum side on this. So good night, Sheesh. If Virginia can.
Good night, Sheesh, Eric, Dukwu. We really appreciate this. I like seeing home right now. I wanted to tell you guys that I met Eric in 2017. I was invited to a Smithsonian Ladies' Voices. Recovering Voices. And they sent me the packet and asked me to choose some artifacts that we wanted to see. And we were taken to a resource room. Well, we looked at some of the natural history in the American Indian Museum. And then we went into a resource room in the back and we could see the items that I had chosen by looking through there. I think I chose 30 Wrangell items and 16 items from cake. And we really looked at all of those things, and I met Eric and his wife, Lori, the first time I'd ever been to Washington, D.C., and it was very interesting. We would go through the Marriott Hotel to get down to the Metro, and when we were underneath there, the highway was above us, and the ladies would call it like we were walking through a dry creek bed underneath the thing there, and it was very interesting. And we went into Crescent City. There were other people with us in 2017 from Aingoon and from Juneau and Kirkwan Cake, Kanak, Ruth Demert, Kakatlat, Florence Sheekley, Linda Wynn, Logjam Master from Aingoon, and Shken George and Gabby, her daughter, and what is his name's not Gabriel? It's Garfield George. And then Shaksani Keek, Shirley Kendall came in with her husband Keith. It was just wonderful to be in there. I got invited back again in 2023 of November to take a look at this with the Wrangell Cooperative Association. It is electric there in Washington, D.C. and in the Smithsonian. I would suggest people go there just for that. Everything's happening there. It's very, very wonderful.
Good and bad.
Good and bad. I really liked it. And looking at those bears there and helping scan and looking at all the other artifacts in there, I really felt the spirit and the power from those grizzly bears, you know, and they were up a little higher, and that's when I was like, whoa. They're very, very real. And looking at all those mud shark paddles also. We all were holding one in that picture. Mm-hmm. The Wrangell Cooperative Association are very, very positive in digitizing this, and it was wonderful to see your friend Dan, to see that Teikweidi hat. And all those things there, it was, you know, looking at those big machines going into and seeing where, I don't know how to say his name, and Chris, I heard Chris's name. Yes, and we got to look at all the things that they worked on. And it was just really wonderful, and the hospitality of the Smithsonian is outstanding. And yeah, we really love it there. It's very hospitable. And we got to go in again and look at the Tyrannosaurus Rex, which I love, and the mammoth in there and things like that, and the the Museum of Natural History. And I did go see that capsule that John Glenn circled the Earth, and oh my gosh, it's put together with rivets. That's what it looks like. I was like, whoa, it's so little. It was just very interesting to me. So I just really appreciate this. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here and to present with you and to tell you and to have our Raven Lady Jock there standing there for support with you in the loss of your good friend Dan Brown and colleague.
Thank you, Gunakshish. And I think a lot of people here felt that loss with Dan, as many others, but his legacy, and I think the legacies of the communities like Wrangell Cooperative Association, what we do together will become legacies for future generations, I hope, in good ways.
And I neglected the tribal administrator is Esther Ashton, and the president is Ed Relatus, vice president Jason Clark, council member Sandy Churchill was there, and Luella Knapp, she's on there, and Jason Clark, they were all part of this, and I tagged along. Mm-hmm.
And I think we'll open it up for questions together in just a minute, but let me highlight that I forgot that I have some actual 3D replicas here that we can share with people.
Yay. Don't pocket them. Oh my goodness.
So this one, do we have Darlene C? Is Darlene still here? So this is a collaborative project we've done and shown a number of times at Clan Conference before. So this has been out before and has been written about and published about. But Wrangell Cooperative Indian Association repatriated 53 shaman's funerary objects from our museum, but then asked to leave them there on loan temporarily while we worked with them to 3D replicate as many objects as possible so they could have replicas to teach with for educational purposes, and they could have a set to leave with the Smithsonian for educational purposes, while they ultimately they may choose to sequester or lock away or do something with the original objects. But we did want to let you know these are shamanic funerary objects. These are replicas of them. Spirit songs were done for the originals before the work was done on them, and then the goal of this in mind was to be able to have something that could be handled safely by children, by others, without spiritual risk or without the chemical risk of exposure to the mercury or pesticides. And Darlene C. is going to be taking this back to Huna after the conference there. So I will ask her to take it around to show you and share with you as appropriate. But there are beads even printed inside it. These were CT scanned so we could get the entire interior structure.
Wow. Can I speak? Gulchish, Eric, Gulchish, for all your work, and our previous tribal administrator, Bob Starbird, who met a lot with you and was very passionate about this project. Gulchish, for all you do, and not just for HIA, the Huna Indian Association, but for all our people. Don't have to say much about that. Your heart is truly leads you in all the work that you do in Gulchish. And this is really delicate here. Eric showed you about the beads there. I'm going to take it around. Please don't shake it, because one thing Eric did say that those beads will rub off each other and eventually turn to dust if it's shaken too hard. Gulchish.
So it is a bit like ceramic. You might be able to feel the weight of it, a little heavier than wood. And thanks to Mary Beth Moss also as acting tribal administrator, initiated the repatriation request on behalf of the HIA to begin the process of that relationship with the tribes. And another 3D replica that we have, and many of you have seen before at clan conferences, is this 3D printed Tlingit spear thrower, or wáan. Not an atlatl. We don't want to give the Aztecs credit for naming everything. This is an exact 3D print of a spear thrower in Natural History Museum's collections, and it's printed in high strength nylon because then we can take it outside and throw spears with it with kids and teach with them and make these for culture camps. Ketchikan, I think, just used 2 sets of these in their culture camp just recently. So we're reintroducing the spear throwing with Tlingit throwers, not Yupik or Inupiat throwers, Tlingit throwers. There's only 24 known in the world, and they're all in museums. And I'll pass this around. This is very strong, so if you drop it, probably won't break like that one. But and these are pictures of the originals and the replicas side by side. Normally, we would do actual workshops where we take people out and throw spears on the campus here. We did that a couple times already, but I just had to bring too much and too little time. I was in Alaska last week, so I had too much to carry. I couldn't bring spears with me this time. And one last thing I wanted to share with you is a recent example we just completed with the Yupik, the village of Igyagig in down near Lake Iliamna. President Alexander Salmon came, and we repatriated human remains to their community in 2017, and they visited and looked at other objects there. And after the repatriation, then they looked at what more could they do in relationships with the museum, how more can we work together to go beyond repatriation. And they were excited to see the 3D examples from working with the Tlingit, and so they asked what could they do in their community, and they decided they wanted to replicate 6 objects to make so that kids can have examples in hand for their culture camps to learn to carve from combs, spoons, dishes, a spear thrower, and this dance mask. So this dance mask is the first example of a 3D print with a color printer. The print that Darlene has was hand painted by a model maker after it was 3D printed into gypsum powder, so it's kind of like a ceramic. This is a type of plastic printed on a UV printer that costs $250,000. So UV light actually hardens it as it comes up out of this resin, and when it first comes out, it kind of looks like a glowing face of an alien covered in butter, and then they scrape that butter off and soak it in, and then it comes out like this with the color embedded in the resin. And this had feathers attached to it at one time, labrettes, and those parts of those were digitally erased, but there's still markers for those because the community actually wanted one out of wood, which Chris Halschwander milled one out of wood, and then out of wood that they sent to us from their community, and then they will use this as a guide to print or to paint the colors onto that wooden mask. So this is just a step to get towards their wood mask that they intend to put spirit into and put back into use. And this was actually a failed print. You can actually see they actually print the label from the museum on the back of the mask, and I had our guys digitally erase that, but then when they went to print it, they grabbed the wrong file, and so this was a printing error, and the one the community has in hand is better than this one. So I'll invite you to pass that around as well and see what the technology can do today. So it's getting better all the time. And with that now, I think we'll open it up to questions for Virginia or I.
Can I say?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
One more thing I wanted to let you guys know when he's talking about collaborating with the schools and for children. In 2017, when we went in there, I brought a 3D camera in, and it had been the first time that the Smithsonian had a camera in some of those rooms, those exhibit rooms, and we got really good pictures. And then it's 4 hours different in Alaska to the Washington, D.C., and so my class was at 8 o'clock, so at noon we'd stay there lunchtime so that we could FaceTime the kids in the class to look at stuff. It was really something to be there for 2 weeks and look at the overflow in the resource rooms. It was wonderful, and I just really appreciate it all. Okay, he wants you guys to have questions.
Any questions from the audience?
Okay.
I just want to ask,
I'm coming down fast as I can.
I was curious about what kind of software and hardware was used in the process of making that hat. Is it the same for these other objects? And is there techniques that are maybe more accessible that people can do at home? I have a 3D printer. I think you maybe stopped by my gallery and checked it out. I'm not really sure. Oh, you can't hear me?
I caught part of it, but the door was coming in.
Yeah, so just asking it, what kind of techniques were used to produce this, hardware, software? And is that maybe something somebody can do privately, or is it at the scale of just the Smithsonian?
Yeah, good question, because we didn't go into that too much. You saw the scanning of the brown bear hat. The mother bear hat was using a structured light scanner. And there are two main types, a Spider and an EVA, that they use for the structured light scanners that a lot of museums use. Smithsonian has a couple of those. The Smithsonian also has a Faro arm scanner, which is a laser arm scanner that you bolt down. In 2012, we brought that to Clan Conference and bolted it to a table, and that has really highly accurate laser scanning geometry ability, but it cannot capture color. So if you're 3D printing in color, or if you're putting it up on the web, it won't have the color there. One of the best and most common techniques is photogrammetry. And again, didn't show that here, but we've used it. That was what was used for that mask, that UPIT mask, was photogrammetry. And that, you just need a good camera and software. And some of the software is free. The really good software is a little more expensive, maybe $1,000 for educational license. Agisoft software is one that some people are using, but some are trying to get away from that because it's a Russian software. So since the invasion of Ukraine, some people are trying to pull away from that. I think Metashape, there's a few different types of softwares the Smithsonian uses, and they will move between the softwares depending on what tool they need to be able to modify a digital model. And I'm not a digitization expert myself, but I'm a tribal liaison. So I liaise between the digitization teams that have the tech and have the software. The Smithsonian has a digitization program office that does this for the entire Smithsonian. So they're the ones who scanned inside and out the entire space shuttle and put it up on the web. They're the ones who digitized the eye of a bee and put it up on the web. And they have 2,700 objects digitized by the Smithsonian. Amelia Earhart's flight suit, Abe Lincoln's death mask, all up on the web that people can go and look at in 3D. And you can download and print all of those except two objects, the Teikweidi killer whale hat and the sculpin hat, because clan leaders do not want people printing those at will. They want people to study them and see them, but not be able to make copies themselves.
That was my other question, was how does a clan go about maybe protecting some of those sacred objects that are in the collection?
You mean protecting them with the digital?
If somebody doesn't want them to be downloaded and reproduced.
The challenge is to keep people from scanning things without permission, right? And so in some senses, they need to work with museums to help educate them about what they feel strongly about shouldn't be 3D digitized, because there is a move. Museums are trying to digitize more things and put them up on the web. And right now, the majority of the movement has been to 2D digitize and put it up on the web so people can see that they have them in the first place. Because a lot of communities just don't know what museums have, and they see lists, they're sent lists, they're mailed. Half the time they're not identified correctly. They want to see pictures. So everybody wants to see at least a 2D picture. That's maybe fine. It may not be appropriate in all contexts, but at least they get an idea of what's there and can ask for that picture to be taken down. But as museums, as it gets more common and easier to do, as they 3D digitize and put things up on the web, then it's Wild West in what people can do with those if they make them downloadable and printable. You can put them on viewers, as we saw our colleagues in Germany are interested in putting up on viewers for people to see and help and consult and share information back. And we've done that with funerary objects that were real sensitive for community, digitize them, put them on a viewer that only they could see, or whoever they share the link with can see. So they determine who's appropriate to see that, and then we can consult and they can study the object up close. But once you make it public and make it printable, some museums are doing that without asking people, and they're just putting it up on the web, and they feel like the whole world should have rights of access to it and the right to 3D print it. And that's where I think we have to educate people a little bit more about the ethics of 3D. I'm actually on an international 3D ethics and cultural heritage team that is trying to publish articles to let people know that while we can't stop people from doing that, there's no laws, there's no regulations against doing that right now, we can at least share good models of collaboration and cooperation and to try to discourage people from doing things in bad ways. Right now, the Tlingit have been very supportive of 3D digitization and replication. I feel like, in a way, it's an extension of the important practice of witnessing. You need witnesses to validate what's done, and 3D gives additional extensions of sharing and showing people what's happening and to remotely access things. But they also want control of the cultural patrimony and not have people making paperweights or earrings without their knowledge and consent. So far, clan leaders are okay with showing them. And many of the clan leaders that we worked with when we've digitized here at conferences, we digitize them and we just set aside the file. In case something happens to it, it could be tapped in the future. They could provide those 3D files to a traditional carver to make it in the old way, but use it with real measurements and see it in multiple angles because that hat won't be there anymore. The village of Hoonah burned in 1944, as we learned from the film the other night. If you didn't catch the film, you'll have to watch it when it's recorded and share it. But the village burned in 1944, and I understand all but 2 hats were lost. Noradana's father, I think, made 1 or 2 hats as a replacement, but again, could only go by memory and by photographs. Did an incredible job. When the Brazilian National Museum burned down a few years ago, their Smithsonian burned to the ground. And Harold Jacobs sent me a text and said, 50 to 60 Tlingit objects in that museum. What if we had digitized them before that happened? So more and more, it kind of projects, we almost have a responsibility to at least 3D digitize as backup as much cultural heritage as possible in case they're needed for some type of replacement or repair. They're a backup, they're an archive. So I probably went far beyond your question, but thanks, good question, important question. But we use also CT scanners, micro CT scanners, medical CT scanners. That's how we can see the inside of the rattles, 3D replicate objects with interior geometry. But photogrammetry, just using a good camera and software, is really available to everybody right now. You don't have to have a CT scanner to do that. On your cell phones, I don't have it on mine yet, many cell phones you can buy software and apps that have LiDAR built into it to where you could scan a clan hat in just a couple minutes with the cell phone. That's something that I think the people should be concerned about. Objects brought out in celebration or at Kawik, if you see somebody going up and doing that with their phone around a hat, somebody should intercede as soon as possible and make sure what they're doing is authorized because they could be 3D scanning the hat. Guerrilla scanning is what we call it, and it has happened in a few cases. The Elgin marbles at the British Museum, a lot of people want those returned to Greece. People did go in with cameras and just photograph those. They allow photography of it, but with photogrammetry, they then made 3D digital models, and they began milling out of actual marble exact replicas of that. They were trying to do it to put pressure on the British Museum to return the originals, to show the museum they could have exact copies in the same marble that the originals were made from. But in reality, they were also doing it without authorization from British Museum, and I think without authorization from Greece, too. So there's pros and cons to it, but it is something that I think clan leaders are worried about, and worried about the commercialized use of the 3D files for mass production and sale.
We have a question over here.
You haven't talked about costs. But could you give us an idea of what it would cost to replicate, for example, a hat versus the Sheikh's canoe?
Good question, and the costs.
Thank you.
And it can vary by object and vary by technique. And there's no real fund, even within the Smithsonian, for doing this. So I kind of leverage different parts of the Smithsonian to get this stuff done. Beg, borrow, and steal, and say, do you have time to do this? Do you have time to do that? In some projects, we can get more help from the Digitization Program Office, like in the case of the Nanyayi. They're very interested in telling the story on the web and putting 3D models on the web. So then I can get Digitization Program Office to invest their time in scanning. You see a whole team there, lots of equipment, and they will process the files and put it up. And I have no idea what the cost of those are, but it's probably very high. For the sculpin hat replication that we did, again, because the clan supported ultimately telling the story on the web, we got a lot of free processing involved there. But then making the hat physically, when I go to the model makers, their shop has to charge for their time and their for some materials that they put into it and the wear on the machines. And so it ultimately cost $26,000 to make 2 of those, because we made an exact duplicate of the new hat, because the Kick City wanted us to be able to tell that story at the Smithsonian as well. So we made the new hat for them that they made into Atu, and we made an exact replica of the new hat that we can exhibit. And the total grant for that was $26,000. And I think it cost something like $1,100 for us to ship the wood from Huna down. And so sometimes the materials were a big significant part, especially trying to get them to DC. The wood to Juneau, I can't remember what that cost, but alder was cut in Juneau and shipped to us in DC. So it's kind of item by item. But on the brighter side, those 3D printed spear throwers cost $125 each. In part because we did the 3D files, but they had to be printed high strength nylon. And the Smithsonian doesn't even have the capability of doing that. Those printers cost about $1 million a piece. And so we had to put those kind of online with a company called Shapeways that then they contract that out to Europe, or we don't even know where the files were sent, but they were restricted. They print the printer or the thrower, and then they mailed it to me. And then I colorized it with a Rit dye, cooked it on my stove, made it a dark chocolatey color, and rubbed shoe polish into it, and then I inlaid the shell into it and finished it. So $120, $125 each. And so we have made sets of those for Ketchikan and for Central Council, and we hope to make more in cooperation with the clans. So it kind of depends on the object and depends on the material that you want to have it made from. I'm not sure what they would charge us yet for some of these resin prints like this. Probably for the mask, it may cost $1,000 for that color print of the mask, really object by object. But it depends. Thank you.
Ganesh, I just had a quick question about repatriation and scanning items for the Smithsonian, possibly to keep, possibly to display. I can't imagine the intricacies of repatriation and what we would have to go through, but it sounds like you do know some of the objects belong to certain clans in Washington, D.C., and are there any, is there any desire to kind of mass apply this to artifacts not just of Lincoln heritage, but of other people's heritage? And are we going to have museums full of 3D printed objects someday? Or just wanted to know your thoughts on the future and how to apply this.
Could we have museums full of 3D printed objects someday? Yeah, that's a possibility. I guess in a way, you've had museums full of replicas in the past already. Many things in museums all around the world are replicas. Most of the dinosaur exhibits, they're not real bones. They are 3D casks. And since the 1800s, people have been making plaster casts of sculptures, of Greek sculptures. You go to many modern art history museums, and they have copies of the same sculptures. Almost none are the real thing anymore. And in those cases, we've been accepting of that's not the real thing, but it gets me close to seeing what it's like. Even in the fossil museums, in our museum, we have displays. We have the T-Rex, as Virginia mentioned, seen, and the diagram of the T-Rex will show you which bones are real and which ones are 3D casts. And oftentimes they were cast by traditional model makers where you make a mold and you make the bone. And so in some contexts, we're already used to that, and we're accepting of that. And it may happen more for cultural heritage items too. One thing we want to stress is that we are not doing this, and I think other museums are probably not doing it. I hope not. We are not doing it in lieu of repatriation. We are not doing it to get out of repatriation. Until the Sculpin hat, all the projects that we did were of items that we repatriated first, and then the community asked us to 3D replicate them for educational purposes. The very first time we did this was with the Delaware and Stockbridge Munsee, and we were repatriating human remains and a 16-inch pewter pipe that was made by the Dutch from the 1600s, very rare, and it was from a grave. And they were getting that back as a funerary object, and they intended to rebury it. And because they'd come to the museum and see what our models makers were doing in exhibits for the Australopithecine and the Neanderthals, they said, hey, can you use that 3D technology to make a copy of that pipe for us? Because we'd like to have an example we could teach with in our tribal offices about what we repatriated, what we reburied, because we're going to rebury that original. It's not going to be accessible anymore. We never heard of that. We never would have proposed that. We would have assumed it would be too sensitive for a community to consider that, and they asked first for us to attempt it. So we rushed quickly because the repatriation was scheduled. We made a 3D print of the pipe, took it to the reburial. They reburied the remains, and it was white because it was printed quickly. They didn't do color. And an hour later, they came back and said, well, we like what you did, but it's white. So we wanted to loan you back the original now, take it back to your model makers and have them use that as a guide for painting it to look just like the original, and then make 2 more for the other tribes involved in the repatriation. So we all can have one. Again, never would have thought of that. So we've had trouble keeping up with with stretching the envelope thinking of tribes and clans and where it could go and what's appropriate. So I never make assumptions now about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. It's got to be communities. I share what the technology can do and what others have done. And then clan by clan, tribe by tribe, they will decide what's appropriate. But I want to make clear we're not attempting to do it in lieu of repatriation. It's often added on to repatriation. Some tribes have seen it as a way to potentially encourage museum to give up an object for repatriation because they can tell the museum, hey, I can give you a replica. If you want to teach about it and educate about it and tell the story of the repatriation you did with us, you can have a replacement for it. But let us have the one with spirit in it. Let us have the original to continue its purpose. So we are one of the only museums in the world that is not just going to digital world, but back to the physical. So all of these examples are very rare that I've told you about. A museum in Maine made a frog hat with the Kiksadi that they again repatriated the original and are making a replica. And I think there's the Sami in Northern Europe are experimenting with 3D digitization of some drums and replication in conjunction with repatriation. But very few have done it so far. And again, it's going to be case by case as to what people consider to be appropriate. But I think it will become more common. And hopefully more tribes will be doing it themselves because we are hosting tribes that are coming in with their own technology, their own equipment. They're digitizing things in our collections, and they're putting them up on the web, on their own viewers, and they're telling their stories. The Shoshone, Northwest Band of Shoshone came to us, and they were digitizing objects, and they're very skilled in this. And they're willing to do the work for other tribes, too, to help them out. They lost most of their material possessions in the 1860s something, 1863, I think it was. They experienced the largest massacre of Native Americans in U.S. history, over 600 people killed at the Bear River Massacre. It's not known well because the Battle of Antietam, I think, happened the next day, and newspapers were captivated by that more so than they were an Indian massacre in Utah. But they lost a lot of people and a lot of their material cultural heritage in that. And in the 1970s, their entire village was burned, or houses were burned when they were out harvesting in the fields, malicious arson, and they lost a lot of objects. They came to us and they said, what you have, even though they're not ceremonial sacred objects, they're almost as important because they're so rare in our communities. And they said the few real objects they have, they're very concerned that in 10 years they might not be there. And they're wondering, could they deposit the originals with us and work with us to make 3D replicas they could have back in the community, because we have the fire suppression systems, the security, the climate control that can care for objects for hundreds of years. Never would have thought of that. Never would have thought communities would be looking to deposit things with us, and they might prefer to have a replica so they can ensure cultural perpetuation that way. Again, we never would have assumed that, but all avenues are open now with this technology. Any other questions?
Any other questions? I have one. I was wondering about the rattle that you gave to Miss Darlene C. from Huna. Is there a name for that object?
There is, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
You don't know? Wrangell had one of those rattles come back years ago.
And I think there's different names for the different shapes of rattle too, right? There's a raven rattle, what some people call chief's rattle, and then the oyster catcher rattle is
oyster catcher that
different
came
name
back,
for that.
Yeah, but they figured it was raven, and that's a raven rattle.
That's an oyster catcher rattle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah. Well, Gunakshish, thank you all. Thank you for your patience and your time and sharing with us.
Gunakshish.